Marcus was not the kind of man who drew much attention. He worked quietly at a small-town auto shop, wearing the same faded uniform every day, carrying a rag tucked into his belt and a broom always nearby. People called him the Custodian, and that was all he was known for. His job was simple. Sweep the floors, clean up oil spills, take out the trash, and keep the workshop neat for the real workers, the mechanics. Customers came and went, often passing him by as if he were invisible, never once wondering who he was or what he might be capable of. To them, he was just a background figure, someone who kept the shop tidy but nothing more. Yet inside Marcus, there was a quiet curiosity that no one noticed. Every day, as he swept around the grease-stained floors and wiped down dusty workbenches, he found himself watching the mechanics. He watched the way they loosened bolts, the way they leaned over engines, the way their hands moved with confidence. He never interrupted, never asked questions, but his eyes followed every detail. Over the years, he had silently built up a mental library of how things worked. He didn't have the money for school, he didn't own fancy tools, but he had something many overlooked: patience, memory, and a deep hunger to learn. Still, Marcus knew his place. He didn't dare step into the role of a mechanic because he thought nobody would take him seriously. The men in the shop joked around him, sometimes calling him the floor man or mop guy. He laughed along, but a small part of him wished he could prove he was more than that. After all, he had grown up around cars. As a child, he used to watch his father repair an old pickup in their backyard. He remembered holding the flashlight while his father tightened bolts and explained how engines breathed like living things. Those memories had never left him, and sometimes, when he passed by a car with its hood open, he felt the same fascination he had as a boy. Marcus didn't complain about his life. He was grateful for steady work and a paycheck that helped him get by. But every day when he looked at the mechanics solving problems, he wondered if he could do it too. Could he handle the weight of tools in his hands? Could he face the frustration of a stubborn part that refused to move? Could he take apart a machine and bring it back to life? He had no proof, and so he stayed quiet, letting his dreams live only in his mind. Most people at the shop barely noticed Marcus beyond his chores. They didn't know that after hours, when the shop was closed and silent, he sometimes lingered a little longer. He would peek at manuals left open on workbenches, trace his fingers across diagrams, and study pictures of engines as if they were maps to hidden treasures. He couldn't afford to buy books of his own, but the scraps of knowledge he picked up became precious to him. Piece by piece, he built an understanding, like a puzzle slowly coming together. Marcus was not bold, not the type to boast or seek attention. He lived humbly, arriving early, leaving late, and carrying himself with quiet discipline. But under that calm surface lived a restless fire, the kind that waits for the right moment to rise. He never spoke of it to anyone, not even to friends outside the shop. To them, he was simply a man with a simple job, someone destined to stay in the shadows while others shined. But the truth was, Marcus saw things differently. Where others saw piles of greasy metal, he saw potential. Where others gave up on broken machines, he saw puzzles waiting to be solved. Though his broom and mop kept him busy, his mind was never far from the engines he admired. Each day was a test of patience, sweeping away dust when what he longed to do was turn a wrench. And so, Marcus lived this double life. The world saw him as a custodian, but in his heart, he carried the quiet knowledge that he was capable of more. He just needed a chance, a spark, an opportunity to show what he had been storing inside all those years. He didn't know when that chance would come, or if it ever would. But deep down, he held on to a quiet belief. One day, something would happen to pull him out of the shadows and reveal the truth of who he was. What Marcus didn't realize was that this chance was closer than he thought. The small auto shop that had always been a place of routine was about to become the stage for something unforgettable. His ordinary life as a custodian was about to collide with an extraordinary test that would change everything. Not just how others saw him, but how he saw himself. The day that changed everything for Marcus started like any other. He had arrived at the auto shop before sunrise, as he always did. The place was quiet, the air cool and heavy with the faint smell of oil and rubber. He unlocked the back door, flicked on the lights, and began his usual routine, sweeping the floors, wiping down the counters, and emptying the bins left full from the night before. For him, it was just another ordinary morning. Nothing out of the usual. At least that's what he thought. Around mid-morning, the loud sound of a truck rumbling into the lot caught everyone's attention. It was an old sedan being hauled in on a tow truck. The car looked battered, its paint chipped, and smoke still curled faintly from under the hood. Even before the hood was lifted, the mechanics could sense trouble. The customer who stepped out explained in a frustrated tone that the car had simply died on the road. No warning lights, no small issues leading up to it, just a sudden stop. When the mechanics pried open the hood, a collective sigh filled the room. The engine was a mess. Parts were worn down, bolts rusted, and a jumble of wires looked like they had been patched and repatched over years without any real care. One of the older mechanics muttered, "This thing's a graveyard, not even worth touching." Another shook his head, saying it would take days just to figure out what was wrong, let alone fix it. Engines are complicated even for experts. They are like puzzles made of hundreds of pieces, and one wrong move can make the whole machine useless. This particular engine was not just broken. It was beyond what anyone wanted to bother with. It was the kind of repair that could drain time and energy without any guarantee of success. The customer begged them to at least try. "Please," he said. "This car is all I have." But the lead mechanic was reluctant. The shop already had plenty of work lined up, easier jobs that would pay well and take less time. Spending days on a hopeless machine didn't make sense to him. Around the shop, the atmosphere grew heavy, as if the engine itself carried a curse no one wanted to touch. Marcus, who had been sweeping nearby, paused and looked into the hood. He didn't say a word, but inside, something stirred. To most, the engine looked like nothing but a tangled disaster. But to Marcus, it was different. He saw challenge, possibility, and a strange kind of beauty in the brokenness. The way the pipes curved, the bolts connected, the wires tangled. He saw it not as an end, but as a puzzle waiting for patient hands. The mechanics gathered around, debating whether to reject the job. One of them, younger and full of sarcasm, chuckled and said, "Hey, maybe Marcus here should give it a shot. He's been watching us long enough. Maybe he thinks he can fix it." Everyone laughed. It was meant as a joke, a passing remark to lighten the mood. But Marcus didn't laugh. His eyes stayed fixed on the engine. Something inside him whispered that this might be the moment he had been unconsciously waiting for all these years. "Why not?" he said quietly. The laughter stopped. Heads turned. For the first time, Marcus wasn't just the background custodian. His voice carried a seriousness that no one expected. The shop fell silent for a moment, then erupted in chuckles again. "You? Fix that engine?" One of the mechanics said, still laughing. Another shook his head. "Man, it's not sweeping floors. This is real work." But Marcus didn't back down. His voice was steady this time. "I can try." The statement hung in the air. The mechanics exchanged amused glances. Some thought he was joking, others thought he was being foolish. But one of them, half in jest, leaned in and said, "All right then, let's make it a bet. If you can get this junk running, lunch is on me for a week. If not, well, you'll know your place." The room roared with laughter again. It was harmless fun to them, nothing serious. No one believed Marcus had a chance. To them, he was a janitor, not a mechanic. A broom was the only tool they had ever seen in his hands. But for Marcus, this was not a joke. This was a door opening, a chance to step out of the shadows and into the light he had been quietly longing for. His heart pounded, but his face stayed calm. He nodded and said, "I'll do it." The bet was made. Word spread quickly around the shop, and soon, everyone was buzzing with anticipation. Some mocked, saying it would be over in minutes when Marcus gave up. Others were curious, wondering how far he would even get. The customer, desperate and out of options, didn't object. After all, no one else wanted to touch the car. Marcus stood before the engine, the weight of all eyes on him. It was a moment of truth. For years, he had studied silently, dreamed quietly, and longed for an opportunity to prove himself. Now that moment had arrived, not as a gift, but as a dare, a bet, a challenge that no one expected him to win. And yet, as he reached for a wrench, a calm determination settled over him. This was not about pride or lunch bets, or even proving the others wrong. This was about proving something to himself, that he was more than a man with a broom, more than the label of custodian. The broken engine, dismissed by everyone else as hopeless, had just become Marcus's greatest test. The air inside the auto shop grew heavy with laughter and disbelief after Marcus spoke those 3 words, "I'll do it." For years, he had been part of the background, a silent worker sweeping floors, cleaning oil spills and hauling out trash bags. Now, in a single moment, he had stepped into the center of attention. Every mechanic in the room turned toward him, their eyebrows raised, their smirks widening. One of the younger mechanics, Jimmy, was the first to break the silence. He slapped a greasy rag against his shoulder and grinned. "You? Come on, Marcus. Fixing that engine isn't like wiping down counters. This is the real deal. You'll quit in 10 minutes. His voice dripped with sarcasm, and a few others chuckled in agreement. But Marcus didn't flinch. His eyes remained steady on the broken engine, his voice calm as he repeated, "I'll try." The head mechanic, a burly man named Carl, crossed his arms and studied Marcus for a long moment. He wasn't laughing like the others. To him, this was harmless entertainment, but there was also a flicker of curiosity. He finally spoke, his voice booming through the shop. "All right then, if you're serious, let's make this interesting. A bet." The word bet immediately changed the energy in the room. Mechanics leaned forward, their smirks now mixed with anticipation. Bets meant pride, proof, and bragging rights. It turned a passing joke into something everyone wanted to witness. Jimmy laughed and added, "Fine. If Marcus can somehow bring this dead engine back to life, I'll buy his lunch for a week." He glanced at the others, who nodded with amusement. "But when he fails, which he will, he cleans my station every day for a month." The shop erupted in cheers and teasing. Everyone was eager to join in. One mechanic offered to throw in free coffee for Marcus if he actually succeeded, clearly confident he wouldn't. Another shouted that he'd record the whole thing because no one would believe it otherwise. The customer, standing nearby with worry on his face, hesitated before asking, "Wait, is this serious? He's just the janitor. Can he even—" But Carl cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Relax, sir. Nobody's touching this car anyway. If Marcus wants to play, let him. Doesn't hurt to try." The customer sighed, realizing he had no choice. His car was already dismissed as a lost cause by the professionals. If the custodian wanted to try, so be it. He nodded reluctantly. Now all eyes turned to Marcus. The laughter still rang in the air, but beneath it was a buzzing tension. Could he really mean it? Did he actually believe he could fix something even the professionals refused to touch? Marcus felt the weight of their stares. His palms were sweaty, his heart beat fast, but his face showed no fear. This wasn't about free lunches or extra chores. Deep down, he knew this was the chance he had been waiting for. The chance to show what years of quiet observation and hidden passion had built inside him. He didn't think about failure because failure was what everyone already expected. He thought about possibility, the slim, daring chance of turning mockery into respect. He gave a small nod. "I accept." The words landed like a hammer. For a moment, the room was silent again. Then the mechanics broke into laughter and cheers. Some clapped their hands. Others shook their heads in disbelief. But one thing was certain. The bet was now official. Marcus was no longer just the man sweeping floors. He had stepped onto a stage with everyone watching. Carl stepped closer, pointing at the wreck of an engine. "All right then, Marcus. The rules are simple. No one helps you. No tricks. You fix it or you fail. Let's see what you've got." Marcus nodded again, his eyes never leaving the engine. He wasn't thinking about the laughter anymore. He wasn't even thinking about the bet. In that moment, all he saw was the machine in front of him, a challenge waiting to be answered. The shop's energy shifted. Work paused, conversations stopped, and every mechanic, customer, and onlooker became part of the audience to this unlikely drama. Some expected Marcus to give up after loosening a single bolt. Others were curious, how long could he really last? Minutes? An hour? But Marcus didn't care about their doubts. He reached for a wrench, his hands trembling slightly but steady enough to grip the tool with purpose. He had been waiting years for this moment, and now it was here, not as a gift, but as a dare. A dare wrapped in laughter, wrapped in disbelief, wrapped in a bet that no one thought he could win. For Marcus, it wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about proving himself right. And as the first bolt began to turn, the bet that started as a joke began to feel like something much larger. A test of patience, skill, and courage that would leave the entire shop speechless. The bet was made. The game had begun. The moment Marcus gripped the wrench, the shop filled with a new kind of energy. It wasn't respect or encouragement. It was pure skepticism, wrapped in laughter and doubt. To the mechanics, this was nothing more than entertainment, a way to break up the monotony of another long workday. The idea of a custodian fixing a complex, broken engine was simply ridiculous to them. Jimmy, the loudest skeptic, leaned against a workbench with his arms crossed and a smirk plastered across his face. "Look at him," he whispered to another mechanic, loud enough for Marcus to hear. "He's holding that wrench like it's a broomstick. Give him 10 minutes before he runs back to his mop." The others laughed, some openly, some under their breath, shaking their heads at what they saw as an inevitable failure. Carl, the head mechanic, didn't laugh as loudly, but his eyes told the same story. He had decades of experience and he knew engines inside out. To him, the idea that Marcus could succeed was beyond impossible. Still, he let it happen. There was no harm in watching the custodian fumble around. If nothing else, it would be a story to tell later, the day their janitor thought he was a mechanic. Marcus could feel the weight of their amusement pressing against him, but he didn't let it shake his focus. He tightened his grip on the wrench, studying the stubborn bolt in front of him. He knew they were waiting for him to fail quickly, to prove their doubts right. But instead of rushing, he moved slowly, carefully, the way he had seen real mechanics do countless times. The sound of the wrench squeaking against metal echoed through the room. Some laughed at the way his hands trembled slightly. One mechanic even mimicked him, pretending to shake while twisting an imaginary tool, causing another round of laughter to ripple through the group. But Marcus didn't look up. He didn't respond. Every ounce of his concentration stayed fixed on the engine. The skepticism wasn't just in their laughter. It was in their words too. "This is a waste of time," one mechanic muttered. "He doesn't even know where to start." Another chimed in, "Bet he doesn't even know what half those parts are called." They spoke as if Marcus wasn't even there, as if he were invisible again. But this time, Marcus wasn't invisible. He was at the center of their attention, even if that attention was filled with ridicule. The customer, still standing nearby, shifted uneasily. He didn't know whether to feel hopeful or hopeless. On one hand, Marcus was his last chance, since the others had already dismissed the job. On the other hand, the thought of trusting his car to the janitor felt absurd. He glanced at the mechanics, as if looking for reassurance, but all he saw were mocking grins. As Marcus worked, the laughter continued. Some mechanics placed small side bets, how long he would last before giving up. 5 minutes, one said confidently. 15, another countered. Jimmy shook his head, grinning. "I say he doesn't even get one part off before quitting." The others chuckled, exchanging nods as if the outcome were already written. And yet, something strange began to happen. The longer Marcus stayed focused, the less funny it became. The first bolt gave way with a loud crack, and for a brief moment, the laughter stopped. Marcus set it aside gently, his face calm, his hands steady now. The mechanics exchanged glances, their smirks faltering just slightly. Jimmy quickly filled the silence with another joke. "Beginner's luck," he said, forcing a laugh. A few others joined in, but their voices didn't carry the same confidence as before. Marcus kept going. Each movement was deliberate, not rushed, not careless. It was as if he were blocking out the entire world, seeing only the engine and nothing else. The shop's noise faded in his mind. The laughter, the jokes, the whispers. All of it blurred into the background. But for the mechanics, the mood was shifting. Their skepticism was still strong, but now it was mixed with curiosity. Could he really last longer than they thought? Was this custodian actually serious? They still doubted him, but their laughter carried a slight edge of nervousness now, as though part of them wondered if there was more to Marcus than they realized. Jimmy, however, refused to back down. He leaned in closer and taunted, "Hey Marcus, when you're done pretending, I'll let you clean my station early today. Might as well start now." His words earned a few more chuckles, but fewer than before. The mechanics were starting to watch more closely, less for amusement and more for the possibility, however small, that Marcus might actually surprise them. For Marcus, none of it mattered. He wasn't thinking about the bet, or the laughter, or the mocking words. He was thinking about the rhythm of his hands, the puzzle of the engine, the years of silent observation that had led him here. He remembered his father's voice, patient and steady, teaching him how every part of an engine had a purpose. That memory steadied him now, reminding him that he wasn't just fumbling. He was working with knowledge he had quietly built for years. The skepticism was still thick in the air, but beneath it, a shift had begun. The laughter that once drowned him out was slowly giving way to silence. For the first time, the mechanics weren't just mocking, they were watching. And Marcus, the man they had dismissed as nothing more than a custodian, was quietly proving that sometimes the person you overlook the most is the one you should never underestimate. The skepticism wasn't gone, but the first crack in their certainty had appeared. And the longer Marcus worked, the more that laughter would fade into something else entirely. The shop grew quieter as Marcus continued his work. The laughter that once echoed around him had dimmed, replaced with the low hum of curiosity. But as he dug deeper into the broken engine, Marcus quickly realized that this was not going to be simple. The first bolt had come loose with effort, and that small victory had silenced a few smirks. But now, as he peered deeper into the tangled mess of metal, wires, and pipes, Marcus felt the true weight of the challenge pressing against him. This wasn't just a car with a minor issue. It was a machine that had been neglected, patched up badly over the years, and pushed beyond its limits. Every part he touched seemed stubborn, as if the car itself was resisting him. Sweat began to form on his forehead. His hands, already dark with grease, slipped as he tried to loosen another bolt that had rusted into place. He pressed harder, his arms straining, his knuckles turning white around the wrench. The metal groaned but didn't give. Behind him, he could hear a few chuckles rising again. "See? I told you." Jimmy's voice rang out, smug and confident. "He doesn't even know how to break a simple bolt loose." A couple of the mechanics laughed along, reassured by the struggle they were witnessing. Their earlier doubt in their own certainty seemed to fade as Marcus began to stumble. But Marcus didn't let go. He planted his feet, adjusted his grip, and leaned in with all his weight. For a moment it seemed hopeless, the bolt wouldn't move. Then, with a sharp crack, it gave way, nearly sending him off balance. He caught himself quickly, breathing heavily but refusing to show any weakness. He set the bolt aside carefully, his face calm even as his heart pounded. Still, that was only the beginning. As he worked deeper into the engine, more problems revealed themselves. Wires were frayed, pipes clogged, and several pieces looked as though they had been tampered with by someone inexperienced. This wasn't going to be about replacing one part or tightening a few screws. This was a puzzle where every piece was broken, bent, or missing. Marcus leaned closer, studying the mess. He didn't rush. Instead, he let his memory guide him, the countless hours he had spent watching, observing, and quietly learning. He remembered the way Carl once tested connections, the way Jimmy had cleared a clogged filter, the way another mechanic had replaced a worn-out gasket. Piece by piece, those memories stitched together into a map in his mind. But the mechanics watching him didn't see that. All they saw was a custodian struggling over an impossible machine. "Any minute now," one of them whispered. "He's going to quit." Marcus's arms began to ache from the effort. His shirt clung to him, damp with sweat. His fingers throbbed from gripping tools that weren't his own, heavier and rougher than the broom he used every day. Each time a part resisted, he could feel the eyes behind him waiting for him to give up. At one point, his hand slipped, and the wrench clattered against the side of the engine, sending a loud clang through the shop. Laughter erupted instantly. "There it is," Jimmy shouted. "He's lost it already." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. The sound of laughter burned his ears, but he didn't let it sink into him. He had faced harder things in life than laughter. He had faced long nights of loneliness, days of being overlooked, years of being invisible. Compared to that, the sting of their voices was nothing. He picked the wrench back up, steadying his grip. Slowly, carefully, he returned to work. His pace was deliberate, his eyes sharp, his mind locked into focus. For every setback, he reminded himself of why he had started. This wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving to himself that he could face something bigger than the broom he carried every day. Hours began to pass. What started as a joke to the mechanics was turning into something more serious. Marcus wasn't giving up. He wasn't storming out in frustration or collapsing under the pressure. He kept going bolt by bolt, wire by wire, piece by piece. His progress was slow, but it was steady. The mechanics noticed it too, though few wanted to admit it. The chuckles became less frequent, replaced with whispers. Some of them leaned closer, watching more carefully. Jimmy still tried to keep the laughter alive, cracking jokes whenever Marcus paused too long. But even he was starting to sense something different. The real struggle wasn't just with the engine. It was with Marcus's own body. His muscles ached, his back stiffened, his hands trembled from exhaustion. But his eyes never lost their fire. With each obstacle, his determination seemed to grow stronger. He wasn't just fixing an engine, he was fighting years of being underestimated. When he finally managed to unclog a filthy, rusted pipe and set it aside, the shop went silent for a brief moment. The mechanics exchanged glances, as if realizing that what they were witnessing wasn't just luck or stubbornness. Marcus was working with intention. He knew more than they had ever imagined. Still, no one dared to say it aloud. Jimmy broke the silence again with a scoff. "Big deal. He's still not going to make it run." The words hung in the air, but they carried less conviction than before. Marcus didn't hear him this time. His focus was too deep, his hands too steady, his mind too locked into the machine in front of him. The struggles were real, painful, and exhausting, but each one only pulled him further into the challenge. And though no one would admit it yet, the laughter was beginning to sound less like mockery and more like nervousness. Because somewhere deep down, even the skeptics were starting to wonder, what if he actually succeeds? By the time the afternoon sun slanted through the grimy shop windows, Marcus was drenched in sweat. His shirt clung to his back, his hands were coated in oil and dirt, and his knuckles were scraped raw. The broken engine in front of him looked no less intimidating than it had that morning. In fact, the deeper he worked, the worse it seemed. But something had begun to shift. At first, Marcus had been the subject of constant laughter. Every clang of a dropped tool, every grunt of effort, every pause drew jokes from the mechanics around him. They had mocked his every move, certain that their custodian was doomed to fail. Yet, as the hours dragged on, the laughter began to fade. Slowly, it was replaced with silence. An uneasy, curious silence. Because Marcus wasn't quitting. Each time he faced a stubborn bolt, he found a way to loosen it. Each time a part seemed unfixable, he studied it with quiet patience until a solution came. His movements weren't wild guesses. They were careful, deliberate, the kind of movements that belonged to someone who knew engines in more than just theory. Carl, the head mechanic, was the first to notice the difference. He had spent decades under hoods, and though he had laughed at the bet like the others, his trained eyes caught the truth. Marcus wasn't fumbling. He wasn't pretending. He was applying knowledge. Carl crossed his arms tighter and leaned against a nearby workbench, his face unreadable as he watched the custodian work. The younger mechanics, however, were less composed. Jimmy, who had been the loudest critic, still barked out the occasional taunt, but even his voice carried less conviction than before. Every time Marcus solved another problem, Jimmy's smirk faltered just a little more. The real turning point came when Marcus reached one of the worst sections of the engine, a clogged fuel injector that looked nearly unsalvageable. The mechanics had already written it off as useless. To them, it was one more reason why the car wasn't worth the effort. But Marcus studied it closely, his brow furrowed, his hands steady despite the exhaustion. He remembered watching Carl clean 1 month ago, the way he had dismantled it carefully and restored it piece by piece. Marcus didn't have Carl's experience, but he had the memory of that moment etched in his mind. He mimicked the steps, his fingers moving with patience, pulling the clogged piece apart with surprising precision. The shop grew quiet as he worked. One by one, the mechanics edged closer, pretending not to watch too closely, but unable to look away. For the first time, they weren't waiting for him to fail. They were waiting to see if he might actually succeed. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Marcus cleaned the injector thoroughly, piecing it back together with careful hands. When he finally reinstalled it, his movements carried a confidence that none of them had expected. He tightened the last screw, wiped his hands on a rag, and stepped back just slightly. The silence in the shop was heavy. Carl finally spoke, his voice low but clear. "That's not bad." The words landed with weight. Coming from the head mechanic, they meant more than any amount of laughter. The younger workers glanced at each other, their smugness faltering. If Carl saw something in Marcus's work, maybe this wasn't a joke anymore. Jimmy scoffed loudly, trying to hold onto the old tone of mockery. "So what?" He put one part back in. "Big deal. That car's still a corpse." But even as he said it, his voice wavered, as though he was trying harder to convince himself than anyone else. Marcus didn't respond. He never once looked up to acknowledge the crowd around him. To him, there was no bet, no laughter, no skepticism. There was only the engine and the quiet fire inside him that refused to burn out. With the injector in place, Marcus continued moving through the engine, tackling each section with determination. The progress was slow, but undeniable. Parts that had once seemed impossible to fix were beginning to align, piece by piece. The turning point wasn't just in the engine, it was in the people watching. The shop that had once been filled with laughter now felt like a classroom, with Marcus at the center as an unexpected teacher. The mechanics weren't mocking anymore. They were observing, studying him, some even whispering questions to each other about what he was doing and why. Carl's gaze grew sharper. He saw the way Marcus used tools with care, the way he paused to think before making each move. Those weren't the hands of a clueless janitor. Those were the hands of someone who had been preparing quietly, patiently, for years. When Marcus finally wiped the sweat from his forehead and stepped back for a moment, the silence in the shop was profound. Everyone had expected him to give up long ago, yet here he was, still standing, still working, still fighting. For the first time, respect, small, hesitant but real, began to stir among the mechanics. The broken engine was still far from whole, but something else had already been fixed in that moment. Marcus had begun to repair not just the car, but the way everyone saw him. And though no one said it out loud, the thought was beginning to creep into their minds. What if he actually pulls this off? The custodian who had once been invisible was now impossible to ignore. The bet was no longer a joke. It was a battle, and Marcus was winning one piece at a time. The shop felt different now. Hours earlier, the place had been filled with laughter and jeers, but as evening settled in, it had transformed into something else entirely. The jokes had dried up. The taunts had faded into silence. Even Jimmy, who had mocked Marcus at every step, now leaned against the wall quietly, his smirk replaced by an uneasy expression. Marcus, however, barely noticed the shift. His world had narrowed to one thing, the engine. His body screamed with exhaustion. His arms ached from hours of work, and his knees hurt from kneeling on the hard concrete. Yet his mind stayed sharp, locked on the puzzle in front of him. Piece by piece, He had dismantled and reassembled parts that others had written off as useless. His patience had carried him where experience alone might have failed. The engine, once a lifeless heap of rust and tangled wires, was beginning to look whole again. Wires were reconnected, pipes cleaned, bolts tightened into place. There was still doubt in the room, but it was no longer about if Marcus would quit. It was about whether his effort could possibly pay off. At last, the moment came. Marcus wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve and stood up, stretching his aching back. He looked at the car as though it were an opponent he had been wrestling with all day. The final step loomed in front of him, testing whether the engine would run. The crowd of mechanics gathered closer now. They didn't mock, didn't laugh. They simply watched, their curiosity overpowering their skepticism. The customer wrung his hands nervously, caught between hope and doubt. Carl, the head mechanic, stepped forward. His eyes were steady, his face serious. "All right, Marcus," he said in a low voice. "Let's see what you've got." Marcus nodded. He slid into the driver's seat, the old leather creaking beneath him. His hands trembled slightly as they gripped the steering wheel, but his face remained calm. For a long moment, the entire shop held its breath. The only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock and the occasional drip of oil somewhere in the distance. He turned the key. The first sound was ugly. A choking, sputtering groan that sent a ripple of doubt through the room. A few mechanics shook their heads, already convinced the effort had failed. Jimmy smirked again, his confidence returning. "Knew it," he muttered. But Marcus didn't panic. He closed his eyes for a second, listening to the sound, feeling the vibration. Then he adjusted a knob, pressed lightly on the pedal, and tried again. This time, the engine coughed louder, shaking as though fighting its way back to life. The shop's silence deepened. The mechanics leaned closer, their eyes wide. And then, suddenly, unbelievably, the engine roared. It wasn't perfect. The sound was rough, uneven, like a beast waking from a long sleep, but it was alive. The machine that had been declared a corpse now growled and trembled under its own power. The vibrations filled the room, echoing off the walls, drowning out the doubts that had hung in the air for hours. The shop exploded not with laughter, but with gasps. Mouths dropped open, eyes widened. A few mechanics exchanged stunned glances, unable to believe what they were seeing. Carl's usually stern face flickered with something rare, genuine surprise. Even the customer's eyes welled up with tears, relief flooding over him. Jimmy stood frozen, his smirk gone, his jaw slack. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came. For the first time all day, he had nothing to say. Marcus sat quietly in the driver's seat, letting the engine rumble beneath him. He didn't smile, didn't boast. He simply listened, calm and steady, as though this was the moment he had always known would come. Carl finally broke the silence, his voice almost reverent. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. He stepped closer to the car, listening carefully to the engine, nodding slowly. "It's not perfect, but it's running. You actually did it." The words sent another ripple through the shop. Respect, once unimaginable, now filled the air. For years, Marcus had been invisible, overlooked as nothing more than the man with a mop. But in this moment, he was no longer the custodian. He was the man who had done what they all believed was impossible. The customer stepped forward, his voice trembling. Thank you so much. You saved my car." His gratitude was raw, sincere, and Marcus accepted it with a simple nod. Around the shop, the mechanics were still stunned into silence. Slowly, some of them began to clap. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a hesitant respect that grew stronger with each second. Soon, the entire room echoed with applause. Jimmy didn't clap. He stared at Marcus with a mixture of disbelief and something else. Perhaps shame, perhaps envy. His voice was low when he finally muttered, "Guess lunch is on me." Marcus stood up from the car, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. He didn't gloat, didn't taunt, didn't say a single word about winning the bet. He didn't need to. The roar of the engine, the stunned faces around him, and the respect in Carl's eyes said everything for him. The shocking outcome wasn't just that the engine had come back to life. It was that Marcus had changed the way everyone saw him forever. The janitor had become the man who shocked them all. And the bet that began as a joke had turned into a legend inside that shop. When the roar of the engine finally settled into a steady rhythm, the shop stood still. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody teased or whispered. For the first time in years, every pair of eyes in that building looked at Marcus not as the janitor, not as the man with the broom, but as someone extraordinary. The moment hung in the air like electricity. For Marcus, it wasn't just about fixing an engine. It was about finally stepping out of the shadows. For so long, he had been invisible. People had walked past him, spoken over him, and dismissed him without a second thought. But now, the very same people who once overlooked him were staring in awe, unable to deny what they had just witnessed. Carl was the first to break the silence. He walked slowly toward Marcus, his boots echoing against the shop floor. His eyes, usually sharp and critical, now carried something else, respect. He studied Marcus for a moment before finally saying, "You've got skill, real skill. I don't know where you learned it, but it's there. And I'll tell you what, I was wrong about you." Those words struck harder than applause. To be recognized by the head mechanic, the man everyone respected, meant more to Marcus than the bet, more than the cheers, even more than the engine itself. The other mechanics shifted uncomfortably. Some clapped Marcus on the back, awkwardly muttering congratulations. Others avoided his gaze, ashamed of how they had mocked him earlier. Jimmy, who had been the loudest doubter, stood off to the side with his arms crossed, his face pale. He finally muttered, "A bet's a bet. Lunch is on me." The words carried no humor this time, only the heavy weight of defeat. But Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't rub his victory in their faces. Instead, he simply nodded and returned to wiping his hands with the same calmness he had carried all day. His victory wasn't in the free meals or the silence of his critics. His victory was deeper. It was the quiet satisfaction of proving, not to them, but to himself, that he was capable of greatness. The customer, overwhelmed with gratitude, shook Marcus's hand firmly. "You've saved me more than you know," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. To the customer, Marcus wasn't a custodian or a mechanic. He was a hero who had given back life to something everyone else had declared dead. Word of what happened spread quickly. In small towns, stories like these travel faster than engines rev. By the next day, people were already whispering about the janitor who fixed the impossible car. Some doubted it, thinking it was exaggerated gossip. But those who had been there knew the truth, and they carried that memory with them like a badge of honor. For Marcus, life didn't change overnight. He still swept floors, emptied trash, and cleaned up after the mechanics. But everything felt different now. When he walked into the shop, people greeted him with respect. When he passed by an open hood, the mechanics no longer pushed him aside. They asked him what he thought. They still had more experience, more training, but now they knew that Marcus's eyes saw more than they had given him credit for. The broom was still in his hands, but the label "just a custodian" no longer fit. The lasting lesson of that day wasn't about engines or bets. It was about something far greater, the danger of underestimating people. The mechanics had looked at Marcus and seen only his uniform, his broom, his quiet nature. They never saw the fire inside him, the knowledge he had gathered, the patience he had cultivated. They never imagined he could rise to a challenge that even they refused to face. But Marcus proved a truth that is often forgotten. Greatness doesn't always wear the expected uniform. Sometimes, it hides in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to shine. And when that moment comes, it doesn't just change the person who rises, it changes everyone who witnesses it. The shop was never the same again. Every time a new challenge rolled in, the mechanics remembered that day. They remembered the sound of the engine roaring back to life and the quiet man who made it happen. And whenever doubt crept into their minds, whenever they felt like mocking or dismissing someone, they thought twice. Because they knew now that hidden talent can live anywhere, even in the man sweeping the floors. As for Marcus, he carried on with humility. He didn't seek fame or demand a new title. He simply kept working, with the same patience and quiet determination that had carried him through the challenge. But inside he walked taller. He no longer questioned whether he belonged. He knew. And in the quiet of the shop, when no one was watching, Marcus sometimes glanced at that car, the one that had nearly been left for dead. He would listen to the engine hum and smile softly, not because of the bet, not because he shocked everyone, but because it reminded him of the truth he had always believed deep down. Sometimes the world will doubt you. Sometimes people will laugh at you. But if you trust yourself, stay patient, and never back down from the challenge, you can turn doubt into silence, and silence into respect. That was the lesson Marcus left behind. And for everyone who witnessed it, that day became a story they would never forget. The day the custodian picked up a wrench, faced the impossible, and shocked the world.